Must have dozed off for a moment. Forgive an old chap for catching up on 40 winks. Well now, there can't be many of us left who remember old Thomas Lord, or his first cricket ground. But he's vital to our story. Without him, there'd be no tales to tell. There he is up on the wall. Pleasant looking fellow, don't you think? Amiable sort of face. Well, that's not the whole story. Much of Thomas's early life is a bit of a mystery. We know that he was born in Thirsk in Yorkshire in 1755, and according to family legend, his father William had been a wealthy yeoman who had his lands confiscated as a result of his support for Bonnie Prince Charlie in the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. However, I have also heard it said that William was never a landowner at all, that his name can be found in the Thirsk poor rolls for the 1750s, that he was helped with his rent in 1752, and that in 1756 he was given the money to leave Thirsk and travel down to London. 6 months later, his wife Maria, with young Thomas just a babe in arms, was also given the money to follow her husband, and all the family's rent arrears were paid off. Well, we'll probably never know the whole story, but it seems to me that the good folk of Thirsk were none too sorry to see the back of William Lord. He may have been something of a political agitator. In due course, the family settled in Diss in Norfolk. It was here that Thomas learned his cricket, a game that was rapidly gaining popularity thanks to the support of the aristocracy at the time. Thomas became a very fine cricketer, proficient in both fast and slow bowling styles, but he was also an ambitious young man, keen to make his mark on the world. And so, aged just 24, he set out like his father before him for London to make his fortune. And thanks to a happy combination of cricketing prowess and business acumen, it wouldn't be many years before the game he loved would be forever linked with his name. I first knew Thomas when he was employed as a ground bowler and general attendant at the prestigious White Conduit Club in Islington. We gentlemen loved our cricket, and huge crowds would gather to watch our matches and join in the drinking and gambling that always accompanied them. England in the 80s was gripped by betting fever, and huge sums of money were sometimes gambled on a game. It wasn't unusual for spectators who had themselves placed bets on the match to try and influence the result. And magistrates were often called upon to break up fights and restore order. Players, too, were sometimes waylaid on the roads out of town by pickpockets and highwaymen, and I myself was a witness to the terrible scenes at the Artillery Ground in 1765, when the Dartford v Surrey match had to be postponed after several people were badly wounded by the mob. Things weren't much better at White Conduit Fields. Something had to be done. Lord had proved himself to be a most competent and obliging chap. So we made him a business proposition, asked him to find us a more private venue, somewhere within easy reach of London, where we could play our cricket unmolested by the hoi polloi. Two of our top people, the Earl of Winchelsea and the Duke of Richmond, guaranteed Lord against all losses, and in due course he acquired a lease on part of the Portman family estate in the area then known as Dorset Fields. In accordance with our requirements for privacy, he erected a fence all around the ground and charged 6pence admission. However, the drinking and gambling, I'm afraid to say, continued. Indeed, we all had to pass through Lord's wine shop on Gloucester Street in order to get into the ground. He certainly had an eye for a business opportunity. The 31st of May, 1787, was the day of the first grand match at the First Lord's Ground. Middlesex defeated Essex by 93 runs in a match played for 200 guineas. Lord himself opened the batting for Middlesex, scoring 1 in the first innings and 36 in the second. And so, the Marylebone Club was born. Well, for the next 20 years, both Lord and his ground flourished. We had some grand matches in those days. One in particular I remember, 1793 it was. Two teams put up by the Earls of Winchelsea and Darnley played each other for a purse of 1,000 guineas. 1,000! Well, it may not seem much now, but in those days it was a small fortune. I remember the little old pavilion bursting at the seams with members, and all around the ground you could hear bookmakers shouting out the odds. It was clear Thomas Lord had a success on his hands. That same year, Thomas married Amelia Smith, a girl from a prominent North London family. His wine business also prospered, and in 1807 he became a member of the St Marylebone Vestry and helped to administer the poor laws in the parish, perhaps in recognition of the help his own father had received some 50 years before. Thomas was indeed a charming and good-natured man, but he was first and foremost a canny businessman. Cricket wasn't always the most profitable of businesses, and so he turned to other events to help make the ground pay. He put on athletic contests, pigeon shooting, and once even, 1802 it was, thousands came to see it as the celebrated French aeronaut Monsieur Ganarin ascended into the air in a giant balloon. Ended up in Chingford, poor fellow. Of course, in those days, London was expanding rapidly and the price of land was going up just as fast. In 1811, when the lease on the ground at Dorset Fields expired, Thomas refused to pay the increased rent on a new lease, and the ground was closed. 3 years earlier, he'd had the good sense and foresight to rent out a couple of fields on the Eyre family estate, a little further north off Lisson Grove in rural St John's Wood. So for a couple of years, there were actually 2 Lord's grounds operating at the same time. And when the old ground closed, he simply moved everything, including his turf, to the new ground and carried on as before. Well, we were all very grateful to Thomas for his loyalty to MCC and his determination to keep the club going. But in truth, I'm afraid the new ground was never very popular with the members. In fact, we didn't play a single match there in 1811 or in 1812. And when in 1812 we learned that Parliament intended to cut the new Regent's Canal directly through the ground, well, it could easily have been the end of the club. But as usual, Thomas managed to turn the situation to his own advantage. Somehow he managed to persuade the Eyre estate to grant him £4,000 in compensation and to find him a new plot of land. Right here. And so, for the third and final time, Thomas Lord moved his turf, put up another fence, built another pavilion. And on the 22nd of June 1814, MCC defeated Hertfordshire by an innings in the very first game to be played on the ground we all now know as Lord's. Well, this time I'm pleased to say the ground was a success. And for the next few years we settled in and enjoyed our new home. But Thomas had one last firework up his sleeve. He'd never been entirely satisfied with the profits from cricket, and in the autumn of 1823 he stunned us all by announcing that the Eyre estate had granted him permission to develop houses on the outfield. 16 of them. There would have been precious little land left for cricket. What were we to do? As a club, our funds were minimal, and, well, we were in serious danger of folding. One man was determined not to let that happen. William Ward was MP for the City of London and a director of the Bank of England. He'd been born in the same year the club was founded, 1787, and just a stone's throw from the old White Conduit ground in Islington. He was a fine cricketer too. Out there in 1820, he made a stupendous innings of 278 for MCC against Norfolk. In those days, there weren't many teams that could make 278 in a single innings, let alone batsmen. What a relief it was when William Ward wrote out that cheque for £5,400 to purchase the lease from Thomas Lord and save the ground for MCC and for cricket. Of course, it wasn't long before another disaster came upon us. On the 29th of July, 1825, the Pavilion burned to the ground. Never got to the bottom of it. Some suspected arson. Nothing was ever proved. Of course, all our cricket equipment was destroyed, and we all mourned the loss of one of the finest wine cellars in London. But looking back, perhaps the greatest loss of all was that of all our old club records. As the years go by, those of us who remember the old days are ever fewer in number. On the positive side, the speed with which a new pavilion was built, it was ready in time for the next anniversary dinner the following May, proved that Lord's was, for the time being at least, in safe hands. We were all in agreement when William Ward decided not to change the name of the ground he now owned. After all, no one had done more than Thomas Lord to help bring MCC into existence, and who could blame the man for wanting a comfortable retirement? Old Thomas continued to live in his house on the ground until 1830, when, by now a widower, he retired to West Meon in Hampshire. We were all greatly saddened when we learned, 2 years later, of his death at the age of 76. And all of us there at his funeral, on that cold January morning, were wholeheartedly agreed that Lord's Ground would prove a fitting and long-lasting testimony to one of cricket's favourite sons. Well, off you go, off you go. That's all you get from me. I'm sure you've got more interesting people to listen to. I'm going to stay here and have a little more of this rather disappointing brandy.